Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Ploeg, and I'll be presenting my paper, Fantasy Sport, Damar Hamlin and the Historically Anomalous. One of the main attractions of sport is undoubtedly the lure of the historically anomalous, of seeing that which has rarely, if ever, been seen before. Fans flock to sporting events and tune in to television or radio broadcasts with hopes of witnessing the singular, the miraculous, or the bizarre. Such historical anomalies take various forms: sublime performances, unique stat lines, fluke occurrences, and can be captivating, inspiring, and sometimes even horrifying. On January 2nd, 2023, sports fans were confronted by a historically anomalous incident that for many has evoked all three aforementioned reactions. During a National Football League game between the Buffalo Bills and the Cincinnati Bengals, 24-year-old safety Damar Hamlin went into cardiac arrest and collapsed on the field following a routine tackle. On-site medical personnel administered CPR for 9 minutes before successfully restoring Hamlin's pulse. The game was delayed 6 minutes into the first quarter and eventually canceled as Hamlin was rushed by ambulance to the University of Cincinnati Medical Center in critical condition. The story of Hamlin's recovery and its impact on the sports world is now well known, but the story of the fantasy sport industry's response to this historically anomalous incident and its unprecedented aftermath is yet to be told. With all due sensitivity to the seriousness of this life-or-death incident, and while readily conceding that many, or perhaps most other aspects of it are far more consequential, I will examine the ways in which fantasy sports sites and their participants responded to the overwhelming confusion and controversy sparked by Hamlin's near tragedy. In doing so, I will suggest that this historically anomalous incident inspired in an industry which is so often justifiably criticized for dehumanizing professional athletes a remarkably human response. Such criticisms are neither new nor unique. For years, scholars, journalists, and players alike have reproached fantasy sport and its participants for their role in dehumanizing professional athletes. In his 2009 study, Thomas Patrick Oates argued that fantasy sport perpetuates a discourse that portrays athletes explicitly as commodities and celebrates the imagined buying and selling of them. This discourse presents athletes as products to be consumed selectively and self-consciously by sports fans. In other words, he contends, athletes framed by this mode of fandom are positioned as property, often valuable but ultimately disposable. Brett Siegel echoes Oates' critique in 2021, asserting that through fantasy sport, athletes are dehumanized and reduced to statistics, probabilities, and projections. The athletes in question, he continued, are deployed as collectible, ownable virtual game pieces, cast aside as interchangeable parts. Journalists have levied similar critiques. In the 2015 New York Times article, Fantasy Sports Real Crime, Dehumanizing Athletes, William C. Roden maintained that in the past 20 years, fantasy sport has changed how we watch sports and how we look at athletes. Instead of players to admire and cheer, they've become cogs in a machine, chess pieces to move around a virtual board. The more troubling issue about fantasy sport to me, though, Roden insisted, is that its increasing popularity is masking something darker, the desensitizing effect it's having on fans, numbing them to the pain and injuries that are the stock and trade of violent games like NFL football. He claimed that the problem with fantasy sport is that by its very definition, it's disengaged from reality. It's created a class of fans who view sports only through the distorted prism of their own made-up rosters. The result, he argued, is a chilling evolution in which compassion feels like the real fantasy. In a similar vein, Eric Allen Hall, in the 2017 Washington Post article, The Dark Side of Fantasy Football, contended that many fantasy participants care little about individual players. Instead, they only care about touchdowns, yards, and receptions. They literally reduce players to numbers, erasing their humanity. Fantasy sport, he asserted, dehumanizes the players and ultimately distances fans from athletes they once admired for their accomplishments on and off the field. An increasing number of players have grown sensitive to this dynamic as well. In 2015, then Carolina Panthers running back Jonathan Stewart claimed, "I see fans bashing people's names, cursing them out on social media for not performing because they didn't win $10 in their fantasy football league. You want to respect the fans, but you want the fans to respect the game." He maintained, "I think fantasy football participants don't look at us as human anymore. I think they look at us as an opportunity." And in a 2017 post-game interview, outspoken cornerback Richard Sherman, then with the Seattle Seahawks, argued, "I think a lot of fans out there have looked at players even less like people because of fantasy sport." These criticisms are now quite common, though recent scholarship suggests that they may not be entirely fair. In the 2022 article, Brendan Dwyer, Ben Larkin, and Chad Gobert contended that fantasy participation does not lead to the dehumanization of professional athletes on their particular team. In fact, they insisted the opposite happens. Participants associate athletes with more human qualities than athletes not on their team. Their argument is built upon evidence collected through a series of implicit association tests, or IATs, intended to reveal participants' subconscious biases. While the legitimacy of IATs is debatable, and while studies such as the one mentioned above remain outliers, I would suggest that the Hamlin situation, in its own unique ways, may lend additional credence to the need for this sort of reassessment of fantasy sport and its participants. The historically anomalous nature of Hamlin's near tragedy in early January and the circumstances surrounding it had far-reaching effects. It resonated throughout the stadium, the broadcast booth, the television viewing audience, and the entire sports world. In the moments immediately after Hamlin's collapse, players and coaches on both teams moved from confusion to worry to fear, and in many cases to tears. Some held hands, some linked arms, some embraced, and many prayed. Fans in the stands were stunned into a hushed silence as they began to comprehend the stakes of what was taking place in front of them. Over the course of an hour, ESPN Monday Night Football announcers Joe Buck and Troy Aikman tried to relay what little information they were receiving about the situation without falling into speculation or conjecture. Television viewers felt the shockwaves at home as well, remaining glued to their screens through a series of commercial breaks, eagerly awaiting updates on Hamlin's condition. Players from across the league and from other sports as well tweeted messages of concern and support. Eventually, after an on-field meeting between the two coaches, the teams returned to their locker rooms, and soon after, the league announced the official postponement of the game. 3 days later, and despite the potential significance of the game to AFC playoff positioning, the NFL decided to cancel the game entirely, in order to, as Commissioner Roger Goodell put it, limit disruption across the league and minimize competitive inequalities. The implications of this decision created an unprecedented real-world scenario, as the 12-3 Bills and the 11-4 Bengals had now played one fewer game than the 13-3 Kansas City Chiefs, while the number one seed in the AFC, home field advantage throughout the playoffs, and a first-round bye were all still up for grabs. Wins for all three teams in Week 18 clarified the AFC playoff seeding. The Chiefs secured the number one seed, the Bills number 2, and the Bengals the number 3. But nevertheless left open the possibility of a Chiefs-Bills AFC championship game that the NFL decided would be played at a neutral site in an attempt to ensure fairness. But when the Bengals defeated the Bills in their divisional round rematch, the Chiefs hosted the Bengals the next weekend at Arrowhead Stadium in the traditional fashion. However, the implications were not limited to the real world. The fantasy world was forced to confront them as well, with tens of millions of virtual leagues and often substantial amounts of prize money left hanging in the balance. For most fantasy football leagues, the penultimate week of the NFL regular season, currently Week 17, is usually when championship games, league Super Bowls, if you will, take place. The reason for this is that the final week of the regular season, currently Week 18, is often something of a lame duck week. The vast majority of NFL teams have either been eliminated from postseason contention by that time, or are already locked into a specific playoff spot, which will not be affected whether they win or lose. For that reason, some of the NFL's best actual players, who are also often the highest scoring fantasy players, are rested for most or all of the last game of the season, and fantasy scores are unfairly skewed because of it. It's a much safer bet that in Week 17, few if any teams will be resting their star players. So in that sense, this disruption to the season could not have come at a more inconvenient time for fantasy sport. When the NFL decided to cancel the Bills-Bengals contest, it vacated all the statistics that had been accumulated during the first 6 minutes of the game, as if the game had never begun. Since fantasy football, like all fantasy sports, is wholly reliant upon the statistics produced during actual sporting events, which are then translated into fantasy points, the fantasy sport industry had little choice but to follow suit. The three most popular fantasy football sites, hosted by Yahoo, ESPN, and the NFL, respectively, thus zeroed out all statistics from the game in order to reflect the official NFL record. In other words, officially, all players in the Bills-Bengals game accumulated 0 statistics and thus contributed 0 points to their fantasy teams. And given that these were 2 of the top teams in the NFL last season and had many high-scoring fantasy players on them, including Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, Joe Burrow, Joe Mixon, and Jamar Chase, this was a devastating blow to the chances for success of those fantasy teams with Bills or Bengals players on them. For this reason, while fantasy sites made the decision to follow the NFL in vacating the statistics and thus the fantasy points from the game, they also put into the hands of each individual league commissioner the power to decide the fairest resolution to this difficult situation for themselves. Instead of zeroing out the points, commissioners were given a variety of other options, all outlined in announcements downplaying the significance of fantasy football in light of the current situation and sending hopes and prayers to Hamlin and his family. Those options commonly included converting player projections or weekly player scoring averages to actual points, combining scores in weeks 17 and 18, vacating week 17 scores entirely and using week 18 scores instead, or using points scored by only Bills and Bengals players in week 18 and adding those points to the rest of the points from week 17. Fantasy participants were thus empowered to navigate this complex situation largely on their own, and soon interesting and even inspiring alternative solutions emerged. Many fantasy leagues declared co-champions, splitting prize money evenly between the 2 contending teams. This was perhaps the simplest solution, but one that did not satisfy everyone, particularly fantasy team owners who were very likely to win their championship regardless of the points accrued by their opponent's players in the Bills-Bengals game. It also did not take into account leagues that pay out to more than just the first or second place finishers. To address these inequities, author and programmer Nathan Braun constructed the free Week 17 Champion Pot Split Calculator, which uses a fantasy math probability model that takes into account each team's current score entering Monday Night Football, the players remaining for each team, the league's payout spots, and its scoring settings. It thus enabled league commissioners to predict the most likely statistical outcomes of the canceled game and to divide payouts more fairly. Braun launched his calculator on January 4th, and it was visited 15,000 times that day alone. Alternatively, many fantasy leagues, instead of divvying up their prize money, donated it entirely to Hamlin's charity, the Chasing M's Foundation, either directly or through its GoFundMe page. According to a GoFundMe spokesman, a lot of fantasy football leagues are donating their prize pots to the fundraiser and using their league name as the donor name. Buffalo Bills beat reporter John Scott tweeted on January 5th, "Just scrolled through the top donors list to Damar Hamlin's GoFundMe, and among the many celebrities to give, I noticed another group starting to show up, fantasy football leagues." He continued, "What an awesome way to handle a unique end to championships, unselfishly." Originally set up to raise $2,500 for a toy drive in his hometown of McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania, Hamlin's 2-year GoFundMe page has now received over 247,000 donations and raised more than $9 million, thanks in part to fantasy football participants. In closing, I'd like to reiterate that fantasy sport is clearly not the most important aspect of the Hamlin situation, and I hope that by focusing on it here, I've not implied that it is. Nevertheless, I do believe that the response to this anomalous and unprecedented situation by the fantasy sport industry, and particularly by its participants, is potentially insightful and perhaps even instructive. This response suggests that the full story of fantasy sport, while replete with tales of dehumanizing athletes, may also be one of fairness, cooperation, empathy, and generosity. Put another way, while fantasy sport may necessitate that players be stripped of their humanity, the Hamlin situation reveals that what these games do not necessitate is that fantasy participants be stripped of theirs as well. Perhaps, to reframe Rodin's critique, rather than compassion being an illusion, at times our conceptions of fantasy sport itself feel like the real fantasy. Thank you very much.